Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, hello, Dr. Boom is the name, and Hearthstone is the game. Something like that. And this is part 4 of my Boomsday Project card review, and we do have the Dr. Boom hero card today. It has been revealed, and it's pretty crazy. On top of that, I have a ton more cards to talk about, so I'm going to try to get through these a little faster than usual. That said, if you still don't have a lot of time, you just want to see the cards, hit the quick review link in the description below to jump to that spot. Otherwise, let's go ahead and talk about Dr. Boom and these other cards in a little more detail. So here he is, Dr. Boom, Mad Genius himself, the new hero card for Warrior, and he's pretty cool, pretty crazy, and I think awfully good as well. 7 mana, of course, 7 armor here. That's a little new. They've all had 5 armor for hero cards in the past, but hey, it turns out Blizzard can change a number. Exciting stuff. And the battle cry here also really, really strong in a synergy mech deck, because giving all of your mechs rush just makes them immediately impactful. They can suddenly do all kinds of crazy things, and with some of the Divine Shield and Death Rattle synergies mechs already have shown, I think that makes the rush impact even better. They can take value trades, they can cycle themselves off of trades as well if they're doing some kind of Death Rattle thing. So really good battle cry. Very impactful over the course of a game, as long as you have a supply of mechs. And Dr. Boom himself can certainly help you in that regard when we talk about the hero power. So here's how the hero power works. It is essentially 5 hero powers that you swap between each time you hit the button. You never get the same hero power twice in a row. It is random which hero power you get next. If you get unlucky, you could just swap back and forth between 2, for instance, and never get into the one you really want to find. Your opponent does get to see what hero power you're going to have, so they have the benefit of making decisions based on your hero power for the following turn. So they're going to know, for instance, if you summon 3/1 microbots, they might have to have some sort of Despicable Dreadlord play to answer that. But across the board, these are all way more powerful than they should be for a standard 2-mana hero power. They all do something really good and exciting. The challenge, perhaps, is that they don't always do things along the same vector or line. In other words, some of them are a little bit more defensive, some are more pressure, some are more value-oriented. So you kind of have this spot where if you play Dr. Boom, you may not have an obvious game plan going forward, and you might kind of have to shift on the fly, which I think could cause some problems. So let's just talk about these. Micro Squad, there is summon 3/1/1 microbots. Now those are just 1/1 minions, but remember they do have rush, which makes them a little more impactful because they are going to be mechs, and all your mechs now have rush. But just getting 3/1/1 minions is really, really good for 2 mana, as we've seen with Baku, Paladin. Even 2/1/1s is great, and those have synergies, but so will these mechs. They'll be able to be magnetized to that sort of thing. So Micro Squad, very, very powerful. If you got that every time, you'd be pretty happy because you could just keep reloading with tons of mechs. That'd be good. You've also got Zap Cannon. It deals 3 damage. Now that is not just to a hero, that's to anything, which again, really, really strong. Not as good as something like Blood Reaver Gul'dan because there's no lifesteal, but you can use it as a removal tool. You could use it as a damage, just that Baku Hunter damage to the face every turn if you really wanted to do 3 damage if you're close to ending the game. So clearly quite good there. Blast Shield, you gain 7 armor. Tank Up's dream. That is kind of crazy. So for instance, this one and Zap Cannon in particular don't necessarily synergize well. If Zap Cannon, you're trying to hit your opponent's face to end the game, okay, but then you get Blast Shield and you pass a turn where you don't do any damage. Now Zap Cannon can be minion removal as well, so in that way they'd synergize together, but depending on your game plan, they might be at odds with one another. Kaboom, similar idea, deal 1 damage to all enemies. So this does a little bit of face damage, it's not just enemy minions, and it could be that whirlwind effect as well, which certainly Warrior has ways to synergize with. So that doesn't necessarily line up with other plans, right? This is more of a board-based one most of the time, as opposed to like a damage. Could be defensive, but in a late game scenario, 1 damage might not matter against a ton of enemy minions. So where does that one match up? And then finally, Delivery Drone is discover a mech, which is really, really powerful because you'll be able to pick fairly good mechs most of the time because you could take the highest cost one, for instance. So this just gives you an infinite resource tool. So this one's more about value, where you go super long into the game. So again, they all just do a little bit different things. They're all good. You're going to be happy to have most of them most of the time. Sometimes you'll whiff. Sometimes you'll be desperate for 7 armor because you have to stay alive and you don't have it, for instance. And sometimes you'll want 3 damage in the game and you won't get it. It'll line up other times. It's a 1 in 5 chance essentially to get the one that you need. Most of the time, you'll probably be happy with 2 out of the 3 of the 5. So some inconsistency concerns, but ultimately still just very good hero powers and will give you tools to win a lot of games and overwhelm your opponent like most hero cards do. So clearly from a power level standpoint, Dr. Boom Mad Genius, very high. Rush is impactful. These hero powers are cool. But I don't think this card is the ultimate hero card. I don't think this is an instant win hero card like lots of others out there, like those Gul'dan style turns, because of the inconsistency. Also, I think there's some downside to the turn you play Dr. Boom Mad Genius. Like, yes, this rush impact adds immediacy to all your future turns, but it doesn't really do that much the turn you play it. It doesn't have this instant board reload like Gul'dan, or this, super defensive play like Uther, for instance, where you heal for 5 with the weapon and you gain 5 armor and you remove a minion. It's, and I used Uther there, one of the worst hero cards in the game, probably, arguably. So it just doesn't seem to have that big swing turn. There's no AoE like with Hagatha, for instance, or Rexar. So can you stabilize the turn you play Dr. Boom, or are you just going to get stuck in this purgatory where you're not really accomplishing a game plan and your opponent's still doing their thing, and it takes too long for that inconsistent random Dr. Boom value to piece itself all together into a spot where you finally start to gain an advantage because you sacrifice 7 mana and tempo to load it all up. Now, if you have a couple cheap mechs, or if the first hero power you get is good, this might be something that you can play on turn 10. If you play it in a control deck, you might have time anyway if you've stabilized, and then, of course, it's great. So, absolutely a playable card. By no means am I saying this is bad. I just don't think it's at the absolute, tip top of quality. I think it's great, just not perfect necessarily. There are some downsides, which, by the way, not a complaint. I think that's good. I think we need hero cards that have some limitations and limits on them. Right now, they're too dominant and too influential. So this is a much better design, just not necessarily a much better card than some of the hero powers we've seen. So now let's talk about another legendary. This is Paladin's legendary spell, Kangor's Endless Army. 7 mana, resurrect 3 friendly mechs. They keep any magnetic upgrades. So this becomes a board reload tool, kind of something like Priest Spellstone for 7 mana, where you summon 3 or 4 minions, sometimes only 2, but you get the idea. And in this particular case, presumably those minions are going to be pretty fantastic and huge and going to have a lot of buffs and stats and effects, because they're keeping their magnetic upgrades. And in fact, if you play the game right, so for instance, say you have a mech deck, because obviously that's the only case this is going to make sense, and you have Kangor's Endless Army in your opening hand, because you got it in the mulligan, you can say, okay, look, I want to build 3 fantastic mechs. I don't want to build out a wide board of mechs. I want to start stacking magnetic buffs so that when I play my Kangor's Endless Army on turn 7, I'm getting this board of 3 just giant awesome mechs, and that's going to help me win the game. And I'm going to get Ziliax on one, and one's just going to be a big pile of stats, and one's going to have some useful death rattles or some sort of divine shield or extra effect that's incredibly powerful. So you're going to be able to play or design your game plan into a way that empowers Kangor's Endless Army. Because if you don't, if you just play a bunch of random mechs, this has a chance to resurrect some pretty bad stuff, right? There's some downsides. If you play a bunch of 1/1 mechs, Kangors could just resurrect a bunch of 1/1 mechs. But if you fine-tune your strategy and you play in a way to support this card, suddenly that board reload is going to become insane. Compared to like a Spiteful Summoner turn, that'll have nothing on a card like Kangor's Endless Army. You're going to get so much better minions and stats out of that 7 mana than a similar card might provide, and probably even better than something like Priest Spellstone, because you're going to have just a big board of mechs. So in that kind of way, this is a great card. Clearly, if you reload into 3 big things, you're going to be incredibly happy with how well Kangor's Endless Army went. It's probably going to be enough to win some games outright, because your opponent just won't be able to deal with everything. Of course, it still plays in some ways into, wide board clears like Twisting Nether or whatever else. So not a perfect answer, a game-winning card 100% of the time, but still such an impactful and big turn, and your opponent already spent all this time dealing with all these other resources and mechs, and just to have to face them again, that seems like it's going to be annoying. So I think this card clearly has a high power level, a lot of opportunity to swing games and just win games outright. Particularly if the deck is built this is sort of the finisher. If it's a faster mid-range deck that curves out into something like Kangor's Endless Army with just an overwhelming army of mechs and then reloads with a big army of mechs, it's going to be very powerful. So unless your opponent has the right complement of single target removal and silences into an AoE, they're just eventually going to get overwhelmed by all the stats and the big stuff. And Paladin historically has been pretty good at that anyway. The downside for this card is it's got a pretty restrictive deck building requirement. It's going to force you into a mech path. There's a chance a mech paladin deck just doesn't ever work, and therefore Kangor's Endless Army doesn't ever work. Again, I don't think that makes it a bad card. We're reviewing this in a vacuum of sorts, kind of in a non-vacuum, but in the sense that we're looking at the card's merits itself, not restricting it to some sort of meta comparison where we're going to say it's bad because it won't be in the meta. No, it's a good card. It's strong. Will it be played? Not necessarily. That's very dependent. But that's one restriction, so you can only play it in a certain kind of deck. The other restriction is just that game plan. Like, if you need to go wide, if big, tall, stacked minions aren't good because you need to trade into a bunch of small stuff from your opponent, you're going to have to play your mechs as minions maybe instead of magnetic buffs. Maybe you can't force all of it into one big mech. If they run a ton of silence cards, maybe you don't want to magnetize stuff and you want to play minions instead. So if you have to take a flyer as far as your strategy is concerned, you might end up with a pretty bad Kangor's Endless Army because you just had to split your stuff out because the game demanded it, and then your Kangor summons a bunch of smaller minions instead of a bunch of bigger minions, and then it's a less compelling 7-mana play. If you just summon a bunch of 2/2 mechs or something, this is going to be bad. If you summon 3 giant mechs, it's going to be good. So a bit of a check and balance there on the power level for Kangor, which is fine. That's good. It shouldn't always do an amazing thing 100% of the time necessarily. But clearly, if you are able to make it work, strong card with a lot of potential, just some challenges, so not an absolutely perfect design. So up next here, I have a new Paladin secret, the Autodefense Matrix. Of course, 1 mana, it reads, when one of your minions is attacked, give it Divine Shield. And I really like this secret because first off, it's board-based. It's all about minion trading and denying value trades. That's good. It gives a minion a second lease on life, essentially, in a lot of ways, without much downside. The challenge is that it is, in some ways, answered the same way you answer Noble Sacrifice, by trading in a small thing, trade in that 1/1, or use your rogue weapon, whatever it might be, to proc that 1/1 activation, and then you successfully proc the Divine Shield. The upside, of course, is that likely the minion you're protecting could do more damage than a Noble Sacrifice 2/1, so there's some upside for face damage. It might take a better trade into that minion or kill it outright. If they try to attack with a 2/3, for instance, it might still die. So in a lot of ways, the same as Noble Sacrifice, answered the same, which is kind of unfortunate because it's nice when secrets can create more disruption and more unpredictability. I'm not sure it accomplishes that goal, but at the end of the day, it's still just a good result. It's something that you want to happen, and it's impactful. It's tempo-oriented as opposed to value-oriented, which is nice for secrets because they're often played in slightly faster decks, right? Because it's a 1-mana card. You can't run infinite secrets forever. You'll run out of stuff. Now, beyond that, it's not good when there's nothing on the board. You have to have a minion on the board for this to proc, so sometimes it could be a dead secret, unlike something like Noble Sacrifice, but still one of the better Paladin secrets available. That doesn't necessarily make it a good card, just because Paladin secrets at the moment aren't all that competitive, but in wild format with something like Mysterious Challenger could be great. Even Bellringer Sentry in standard format seems like secrets could perhaps still make the cut. Prince Liam turning this into a legendary, that sort of line might be possible if you get more consistent, more powerful board-based secrets. So adding to that package is good. This is one of the better Paladin secrets we've seen. I like the design of it too, this big shield protecting him from some giant mech. That's all awesome. So pretty solid looking card here. Not necessarily in the scheme of Hearthstone, but within the scheme of Paladins and secrets, it's a good one. Up next, we're moving into some Warlock cards, starting off with Omega Agent, another Omega card. I mean, just a reminder, these do a thing at their base level, and then if you have 10 mana, they do a bigger, extra, more awesome thing. Omega Agent starts out as a 5-mana 4/5. Pretty disappointing. No bonus, no taunt, no upside there at her base level. But when you get to 10 mana, if you play her, suddenly she summons 2 copies of herself. So that doppelgangster style, but instead of 2/2s, they are all 4/5s. And you get 3 4/5s for 5 mana. And clearly, that's pretty darn good. 5 mana, 3/4/5s is fantastic. That's an instant board reload in a single card. So there's clearly something about this card that has some upside and some potential. The challenge for me is just figuring out who wants to run her and why, and are there better plays available? Are there cooler things you can do? For instance, she's not a great defensive card necessarily. Your opponent can just ignore all 3 Omega agents on turn 10 and go face. If you've gotten to turn 10, though, you've likely started to stabilize if you're playing a control deck. But if you're in a control versus control environment, how impactful are 3/4/5s? In my mind, not that impactful. So are you playing this in a tempo deck, something that's more mid-rangey and all about board pressure and presence? That's not something we've seen a lot of in Warlock. They're usually more about control, fast aggression with Zoo, or just shenanigans. So I don't know what that looks like, but let's just pretend a more tempo minion pressure based Warlock deck existed. Can you afford to run a 5 mana card that's dead until turn 10? Don't you typically need to maintain that pressure and keep a really smooth curve throughout the mid game? Omega Agent's a little risky there. So if you played it in like a Spiteful Summoner deck, for instance, yeah, she'd be great post turn 10, but you'd be sitting on a dead card the rest of the game, and that's a little bit risky. Perhaps a risk mitigated a little bit in Warlock because they have the life tap hero power to draw more cards, but still feels like a card that might be empty of majority of the time and not impact games when you need the impact the most in that style of deck. So at a base level, fantastic. I mean, unbelievable arena card for the record, like 5-star arena card 100% of the time. But in constructed format, how do you make this work? What deck wants to run this and why? What's it better than? That's where I've got questions. So not by any means a fundamentally weak card. Has a lot of things it does well. Just a big old pile of stats. But nonetheless, I'm not sure it's going to see much play in constructed format. I think there's a challenge to make this card work. Now, maybe I'm just missing something or there's some great line. Maybe it's even a Zoo card that is playable on turn 5 but becomes amazing in the late game as a resource, reload, and final piece of the puzzle kind of thing. Perhaps that's how it works. Maybe it actually is a good aggro card in a weird way. I don't think so, but it's possible. So not completely giving up hope on this card. I just don't see things lining up for it right away. So solid in a way, but still pretty average in actual constructed play. So up next here is another Warlock card. This is Demonic Project, another one of our project cards we got teased, which is when a card does something for both you and your opponent that is supposedly a positive. And this 2-mana spell transforms a random minion in each player's hand into a demon. And that's pretty cool. This is a neat disruption card, which I've talked about a lot lately. In other words, this card can break your opponent's game plan. It can take their Shudderwock and it can turn it into a Flame Imp. And obviously that is going to ruin a Shudderwock Shaman's day. That's not a good thing to happen. It's supposedly a good thing. Projects are powerful effects for both players. Powerful in a negative direction this time around, certainly. And that's really cool. I like that cards like this exist. Unfortunately, this is a class card instead of a neutral card. So not everybody has access to what to me looks to be like a Dirty Rat replacement for a good tech card to combo decks. But it's not Dirty Rat because it's not neutral. So that's really disappointing in a way. That doesn't make this card itself bad or problematic because now Warlock does have access to an extra tool. And frankly, most Warlock decks probably wouldn't care about the downside here of turning their own thing into a demon. And in fact, that could often even be an upside. If you've got some weak early game minion camped in your hand forever that you just can't play, say you don't want to play an Acolyte of Pain because you don't want to draw a million extra cards, probably not the best example for Warlock, but we'll move on. And you can transform it into a Void Lord and you're happy. That's super exciting. It's any low-cost minion could be something bigger, and if it transforms into another low-cost minion, well, who cares? You have a chance to disrupt your opponent's thing. Also, Demonic Project shows you what you got from your opponent and what they got out of it, so you get a bit of an informational advantage. You'll know whether you got their Shudderwock or not, or if you didn't, and that can really change how you played the game, so that's nice too. What that means is you've got a strong card here. This does something really good. It's a tech card that's important. It's not always going to be played because metas won't require it. It's going to have some opportunity costs because you're going to have to run this to disrupt certain decks, and you won't care about this versus aggro, for instance. It's only going to be good in control or combo environments. So do you want to make room for this as a tech card? The same sorts of decisions you always have to make with tech cards like this are going to apply. So not an everyday card, not an every meta card, but an important tool to exist, and certainly a card with some raw strength. It does something you want it to do, so a solid design. So now let's move on to some priest cards. Starting off with the Reckless Experimenter, a new 5 mana 4/6. It reads, death rattle minions you play cost 3 less, but they die at the end of the turn. So first things first, 4/6 for 5 is a fine stat line. Not incredibly exciting, but totally reasonable and scary against other priests in particular with that magic 4 attack. And the effect here, clearly a death rattle synergy sort of thing, and a really big tempo discount. You can play a lot of death rattle minions with Reckless Experimenter. It's even better than Corpse Widow like we saw for Hunter, but that is because it theoretically has this downside that yes, you can play those death rattle minions, but they are gonna die at the end of the turn, and that could be a problem. But it could also be an upside because sometimes you want your death rattle stuff to die. So suddenly cards like Loot Hoarder, which sometimes you play out and they don't really get to activate their card draw, you're going to get to guarantee that card draw activates. You're going to get your Loot Hoarder and you're going to get it's going to die because of your Reckless Experimenter, and you're going to get your card draw, and you're going to be excited about that. You could also use this with something like Carnivorous Cube, for instance. Priest historically doesn't have a great way to activate Carnivorous Cube, a 4-attack minion. How do you kill it? They don't have Dark Pact. They don't have Play Dead. They can now Carnivorous Cube. The cube will die and it will re-summon the 2 things that came out of the cube. That's pretty exciting, and it only costs 2 mana, so it's really easy to flex that into a turn. So you can play 2 Loot Hoarders, a couple cubes, your Reckless Experimenter. You can just completely go nuts with a board of death rattle minions. Lot of potential there. So I like this card. I don't know that it's necessarily going to see play in something like a Quest Priest that's all about death rattle minions, but it just has so much potential. The effect is so strong that I think it's pretty likely somewhere along the line it's going to find some home or set up some important combo or just do something exciting, particularly because the stat line is completely fine. So I think this card rather strong, and not sure exactly how it operates right now. Just does so many good things that it's going to see some kind of play. And speaking of death rattle minions for priest, we have another one here. This is Dead Ringer, a 2 mana 2/1. It's a mech, and it reads, death rattle, draw a death rattle minion from your deck. This is just death rattles on death rattles on death rattles. And this is essentially Loot Hoarder. I just talked about Loot Hoarder for priest. This is a death rattle synergy Loot Hoarder. It's the exact same stat line. It has the upside of being a mech, and it has the upside of drawing a specific kind of thing from your deck, allowing you to cycle into more Death Rattle cards. This looks like the perfect early game minion for a Death Rattle Priest deck, an archetype that is already kind of a fringe thing. Quest Priest is a playable, if not high-tier deck right now, and cards like this, which increase the consistency of the deck, allow you to activate that quest sooner, are probably just going to make that archetype much better. Not to mention with Reckless Experimenter, this is another perfect option because you're going to be able to chain this Death Rattle into more stuff that synergizes with your Reckless Experimenter on a future turn, potentially. So just a complete upside Loot Order, and that's great. That's a good design. I like it. And even if you didn't somehow run this in a quest deck, you could still tutor out specific things if you have one really powerful Death Rattle later in your deck that you want to guarantee that you're going to find. Not sure that exists today, but it's always a possibility in a future meta or expansion. This card becomes a really powerful tutor card as well. So even outside of a specific Death Rattle deck context, even as just a one of or a two of in a deck, to get a specific card, Dead Ringer has a lot of potential there. And we've seen Loot Hoarder is very much a playable card, so I think Dead Ringer in all the same ways will be a playable card for Priest, just even better. Now, it doesn't have the general use of Loot Hoarder, so it wouldn't always be a replacement if your deck didn't have Death Rattles, but of course that's fine. You can just run Loot Hoarder. And Dead Ringer gives you that flexibility, that option. It's also a mech, so if there's some sort of mech deck for Priest, that's a possibility to keep in mind, although Blizzard did suggest that there wouldn't be a whole lot of magnetic support for the non-trio of classes that they've announced magnetic for so far. So who knows how much that's going to matter, but you never know. Dead Ringer is simple and good. And then up next here, I have another Priest card that is also an Omega card. This is Omega Medic, a 3-mana 3/4. As you guys know, I love 3-mana 3/4 stat lines. That's exciting. Also, Battlecry, if you have 10 mana crystals, standard Omega condition, restore 10 health to your hero. So I like this card a lot. First off, it's one of those minions you can just play on turn 3 if you're desperate, and it might end up saving you more than 10 health on turn 3 anyway, because it eats a couple minions in the early game, allowing you to stabilize the board. It's got enough health total to set up for lots of things Priest does, whether that's just making your hero power relevant or starting to buff it with other kinds of things. So really solid, just early game tempo play sometimes in various kinds of Priest decks, probably more control-oriented decks. And then also, you've got this heal in a pinch, this like super antique heal bot, which was a very playable card from Hearthstone's past, but it comes 2 mana cheaper, has extra health, and actually heals more as well. So this is a good example of an Omega card to me that is efficient in the early game. Some of the other Omega cards we've seen aren't quite as efficient in the original mana cost slot. So it's fine there, but also has some upside that still contributes to the same game plan as opposed to a different one. So for instance, the Omega 2/6 taunt that then becomes a 12/6 minion in the late game. That's a defensive card early and an aggressive card late. They kind of operate on different vectors. Omega Medic, on the other hand, can be a defensive card early and can be a defensive card late. So the game plan, the deck that would want a runner, feels like it's still synergistic and continuous, and it has that continuity from early to late game, which is nice. So I think this is a good design. Perfect a tool for priests that want to live for a while. It's one of those cards that even though they don't necessarily run it in a deck, just that it exists, it'll probably show up from time to time somewhere. Solid arena card beyond that as well. So I think Omega Medic looks very good. So now let's talk about Lab Recruiter. This is an exciting card. New rogue minion, 2 mana 3/2. Battlecry, shuffle 3 copies of a friendly minion into your deck. Baleful Banker is somewhere back there in the Netherstorm crying because he only shuffles 1 copy of a minion into your deck, and he's only a 2/2. Now, Baleful Banker, of course, is a neutral card. This is a class card, so that's fine. It's not some scary power creep moment. But this effect, very, very strong. Incredibly cool effect. Does every deck want this? No, of course not. Some decks wouldn't want to shuffle an extra minion into their deck. But there are clearly going to be archetypes and combo decks and crazy shenanigan decks where this becomes so darn amazing. And in wild format in particular, I can already see this with Cold Light Oracles and a Mill Rogue. It's just bonkers. But even in standard, there's going to be some way to utilize this thing. Just because we've already seen Myra's Unstable Element, a card that empties your deck. Suddenly with Lab Recruiter, I can just imagine a billion different shenanigans where you empty your deck and then using some sort of combos and probably cards we haven't even seen yet that you can, you know, create some combination of stuff where you put all this amazing stuff into your deck and you're able to draw only these select subset of cards instead of all the stuff that you had to run initially, and somehow that's gonna empower some really cool play or new strategy or whatever it might be. Who knows exactly what that looks like, but Lab Recruiter just allows you to do those sorts of things at an incredibly high level. We've seen that in the past with Gang Up. This is a super Gang Up with a body attached, and frankly, it's a 2 mana 3/2. Fine stat line for 2 mana too. So you're not even really experiencing any downside to play something like Lab Recruiter. So do I know how this card becomes powerful and what this card does? No, I don't know. I don't know what that looks like, but I know that this effect just does something so cool and so strong and in such a specific direction that there's gonna be a home for a card like this. And you're probably already talking through some combos in your brain and figuring out how you can shuffle a bunch of Kingsbane buffs into the deck or shuffle a bunch of legendary minions into the deck that are just gonna do craziness. Exactly. I don't know. There's a million combinations possible, but this is a good card. Fundamentally, it does something very powerful, good stats. This is an easy 5-star card. I'll spoil it now. I think this card has so much potential. So now we've got a Mage card to talk about. This is Unexpected Results, a new 4-mana spell. It reads summon 2 random 2-cost minions. And this card, weirdly enough, is improved by spell damage. So if you have a spell damage minion on the board, the cost of the minions that you summon will increase by 1. So +1 spell damage would summon you 2 3-cost minions. If you somehow got a Malagos on board, this would summon you 2 7 cost minions. If you magically got 6 spell damage on the board, you'd be really happy because you'd get 8 cost minions, which are much, much better than 7 cost minions. But first off, that's weird. I don't know that I like this spell damage applying to another effect, but at least they did name it Unexpected Results, so they kind of accounted for that weirdness in the card itself, so I guess I'm okay with it. I can live with it. But does that make it good? Well, first off, spell damage has not really ever been all that impactful in Hearthstone. In a couple cases, you've run spell damage in like Freeze Mage for burst damage with things like Evolved Kobold or Blood Mage Thalnos even back in the day. That's really as far as spell damage has ever gotten, just like a 1 of or 2 of in a deck to give you a finisher. It's never been like a core part of a deck, which I do think is unfortunate because spell damage has been a keyword for a long time, but it's just never seemed all that important. This does give us a way to make it important, which is cool, but I don't know that the card is good enough to make that impactful. So let's just break down the math, right? Clearly, getting 2 random 2-cost minions for 4 mana is 4 mana in value for 4 mana. But clearly, random minions aren't very good on average. They have a lot of problems. You don't always get the stats that you like. So if you're just getting 2 random 2-cost minions for 4 mana here, you're really disappointed. This has to get upgraded for it to make sense. Otherwise, it's just way worse than something like Call to Arms we saw in the past. And it's fine to be worse than an unnerfed Call to Arms, but this is way, way worse than an unnerfed Call to Arms. So as you get to spell damage +1, you get 2 random 3-cost minions. And that starts to feel a little better for 4 mana. On average, that's going to be about 3/3 in stats, or in total 6/6 in stats for 4 mana. That feels like it has some upside. If you get to 4 or 5, obviously this gets really, really exciting. It becomes a powerful play. The question is, who's running this? Is it easy and consistent to get spell damage on the board? Shortcut to that answer, I think, no, it's not. So it seems like it's going to have some consistency issues, cost issues, because maybe you land some spell damage on turn 2 and turn 3 on curve, and you somehow hit a good unexpected results on 4, but I don't think that's how it's going to work most of the time. I think you're going to end up playing this like on turn 8 with a spell damage minion the same turn. And by the time that's happening on turn 8, it's a far less exciting play to get a couple 3-cost minions. They just aren't going to have as much of an impact as necessary. So flexibility seems like it's going to be really hard with this card. It's only going to line up at certain times. That awkwardness, the curve restrictions, the fact that it's so dependent on another effect, all of this seems very problematic. Only in a scenario where there's some sort of aura that provides permanent spell damage do I think a card like this would really ever be successful. If it's based on board-based spell damage, so that minion has to live, it has to be present, which is how we understand spell damage today, it feels like this one's just going to be a worse option than many, many other cards you could run, even in a spell damage deck, because functionally spell damage operates along affecting your spells that do damage, and this doesn't seem to line up with that game plan necessarily. So does this fit in like a tempo mage or an aggressive mage? I don't really think so, not necessarily. So to me, this one just looks awkward. It's not totally unplayable because it does have upside. If somehow it magically lines up, it's going to be a good play once in a blue moon. I think it's just the consistency downside is too much for this to be a good card on average. So up next here is the Weaponized Pinata. Great name, fantastic artwork. 4 mana, 4/3 Mech. Death Rattle reads, add a random legendary minion to your hand. So in a lot of ways, this reminds me of Shifting Shade. The card for Priest a while ago was a 4 mana, 4/3 Death Rattle. That gave you a burgled card, essentially a card from your opponent's class. This, on the other hand, gives you a legendary minion. And that's debatable which of those is better. There's some good legendary minions in the game, obviously, but there's a lot of bad ones too, or at least ones that are really synergy dependent and don't necessarily contribute to your game plan much. So a value card, obviously not a board-based tempo card like something like Piloted Shredder, which was a 4 mana 4/3 with a Death Rattle. That contributed to the board. This contributes more towards a longer game plan, a value game plan, and will sometimes high roll and will sometimes low roll. And I think that's okay. This card still looks solid to me. Shifting Shade was a relatively playable card for Priest. It just got onto the board. It contested mid-game bodies, and it gave you something back if you're a slower, more control/value deck. Weaponized Pinata will do the exact same thing. It occasionally will high roll into some amazing legendary that's going to win you the game. Other times it won't really contribute much. You'll get the Millhouse Manastorm or the Lorewalker Cho, but you didn't really sacrifice too much to get that potential upside, right? So if it backfires, if it fails, you didn't give up a ton. You just gave up a couple points in stats, basically, and the high roll is going to make up for any sort of low roll downside, because the high rolls could be game winning sometimes. In that regard, I think Weaponized Pinata is a totally fine card. It's only going to be played in certain kinds of decks that synergize with it via Death Rattles, or perhaps Mechs if you just are desperate for a Mech body. It's exactly the sort of middle-of-the-road card that expansions need, and it's a super hilarious and fun one. So really well done on the design side of things. Power level, probably more average, but certainly an okay card. So up next here we have another cute card. This is Faithful Lumi, a 1 mana 1/1, and it's the little mech, and its battlecry reads, give a friendly mech +1/+1. Bit of a typo there in this card. I think Hearthstone might have got a uppercase I in the word give, but that's okay. We all know what it means. And Faithful Lumi, clearly just one of those mech filler cards. And I don't mean filler in the scheme of things for the expansion. I mean filler within a mech deck. As in, you just sometimes need extra mech bodies to go into a mech list. Clearly, Lumi's going to be better in some sort of aggressive list that's more about getting onto the board early and buffing your mechs. It's not going to be great in a value deck necessarily, because the stats just aren't going to go that far itself, and the buff isn't going to go very far either. So it's more of a zoo-style mech card than a value-style mech card. And that's fine. It's a decent little body. We've seen similar cards to this. If it were a 2/1 or a 1/2, it would be 10 times better, but it would probably be too strong. So as a 1/1, occasionally it's going to let you take a value trade in the early game in your mech deck. And sometimes it's going to linger around as a 1/1 that might eat a magnetic buff as well, so that's important. But most of the time, just a solid little guy. It's not necessarily going to make the cut in every mech list, because it's just not good enough. But a fine addition, important to exist, gives you some options to play around with when it comes to mech decks, and will probably, I assume, make the cut in 1 or 2 aggressive ones, assuming they are, in fact, competitive at all in regards to mechs. So a solid card, just by no means an amazing one. And that said, that wraps it up for all the mechs and the cards revealed from the reveal stream that was released today. But I do have some leftover Druid cards I haven't reviewed yet. These were kind of falling in the gaps last week when I had to make a review really quickly. I didn't quite have time to get to these. So I'm going to move through these 3 remaining Druid cards pretty quickly, because I think you've likely already seen these and heard a lot of discussion about these. They are all 3 Treant synergy cards, which is a new, I guess, archetype being introduced into Druid, where you have cards that summon Treants and cards that do things because you have Treants. Up first, Landscaping, 3 mana card, summon 2/2/2 Treants. This is just one of those cards that kicks things off for a Treant style deck. There are lots of others as well, things like Witchwood Apple, for instance. But I like this card. You get 4/4 in stats for 3 mana. Obviously, it's split across 2 bodies, which isn't the same as getting a 4/4, but nonetheless, still a big pile of stuff that's efficient for its cost. It's great in wide board decks, because if you're looking to get minions out and do things like Soul of the Forest or Power of the Wild or Savage Roar, that's exactly the kind of card you need. It's also a spell, so it synergizes with things like Violet Teacher. So this is in a token deck as we understand it today, with Violet Teacher, Soul of the Forest, all those packages. Landscaping is going to fit in perfectly, I think. It's just a nice little addition that you can play on curve sometimes to be good, and other times you can save up for some big combo reload turn as well. So I like this card. I think it's got potential. Is it going to be good if Treants aren't a thing? Not necessarily. There's probably going to be better options, and decks won't need to run this, but in the right sort of environment has all the strength it needs to be competitive. Beyond that, here we have the Dendrologist, a new 2 mana 2/3. Battlecry reads, if you control a Treant, discover a spell. So this is another Treant synergy card, obviously. This one, though, interestingly, is, I think, more about value. It's more about generating resources than it is necessarily about contributing to the board. That said, though, because Druid spells often are so good with token styles of play, I still think Dendrologist could be an important piece in a token or Treant deck. First off, because you just get the 2 mana 2/3 That's solid sometimes to contest an early board. If you just want to get this out on turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, it's going to do some chip damage to opposing minions. It's going to help you take trades, which can be important. Beyond that, you can get extra Savage Roars, you can get extra Branching Paths, you can get extra Power of the Wilds. All of this stuff, extra Soul of the Forest that empowers your token style and your Treant style of play. So Dendrologist has so many ways to connect positively with this kind of deck. I think he'll probably still make it, as far as, you know, competitiveness with other cards is concerned. He'll make the cut in list just because occasionally that third Savage Roar is going to be so powerful that it's important to run a card like this. And there's not really much downside to running him either, other than just the opportunity cost of sacrificing that slot in your deck for something else. But I think Dendrologist overcomes that, thus becoming another solid Treant card. And then finally here we have the Mulchmuncher. This is, I guess, the big bomb of Treant decks. 10 mana, 8/8 Mech. It has Rush, which is crazy cool. And it costs 1 less for each friendly Treant that died this game. So this becomes your sort of sea giant for a token Treant deck. If you're able to get Treants out early, if you're able to keep reloading them, if your opponent deals with them, this gives you sort of the punish for your opponent dealing with your token-wide Treant boards, because now you have an 8/8 you can play for free, perhaps, or even if it's just, you know, 2, 3, 4 mana, it's still going to be a solid play as an 8/8 that has Rush. It can take a big trade, it can push through a taunt, and then this really aggressive threat is left behind. It's intimidating and huge and scary, and you could play 2 of these in a single turn. You could copy them with Splintergraft and do crazy stuff. There are all kinds of options for a card like Mulchmuncher, and I think it's really, really strong. Now, again, it is dependent on Treant decks being successful, so it may never see play. That doesn't make it a fundamentally bad card. It does a good thing. It has great stats, cost reductions in Hearthstone, historically very powerful, and the Rush means it's going to have an immediate impact as well. I also think this is a fine card off of something like Spiteful Summoner, a new 10-mana minion being added to the pool. It's an 8/8 with Rush, which is better than the 8/8s we get off Spiteful Summoner now. All said, I think a strong card. And there you go, guys. That wraps it up for my detailed reviews. Tons of cards, but now we're going to jump into the quick reviews. Dr. Boom Mad Genius is a 4-star card. Kangor's Endless Army is a 4-star card. Autodefense Matrix is a 3-star card. Omega Agent is a 3-star card. Demonic Project is a 3-star card. Reckless Experimenter is a 3-star card. Dead Ringer is a 4-star card. Omega Medic is a 4-star card. Lab Recruiter is a 5-star card. Unexpected Results is a 2-star card. Weaponized Pinata is a 3-star card. Faithful Lumi is a 3-star card. Landscaping is a 3-star card. Dendrologist is a 3-star card. Mulchmuncher is a 4-star card. And there you go, guys. Part 4 of my Boomsday Project card review is done. Ton of cards. Lots more to come, though. Super exciting stuff on the way. So many new legendary spells, new legendary minions. I can't wait to see it. Dr. Boom's pretty wonky, pretty wild. That's going to be a ton of fun to play. But that said, of course, share your thoughts, comments, all that fun stuff below. Until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.